Hey there, this is part 4 of my series on Isaiah and the Messiah. Last week we entered into the very exciting speech of disputation, the beginning of the courtroom drama where God challenged the people of the nations and their gods to sit in court with him and be judged as to who is and not who is not all-powerful, who can foretell future events and make them happy. Because remember, anyone can foretell the future, as long as you're not too fussy about whether it happened or not. And who can do the impossible, namely, bring back a nation from exile into their own land without any of them rising up in revolt or by actually doing much of anything to make it happen. It's also a message that continues the theme of comfort and promise. It's spoken to a people who've been beaten down by almost 70 years of exile in the Babylonian Empire, who have come to wonder whether or not God is even there anymore, whether he wants to rescue them, or even if he can rescue them anymore, given the ancient Near Eastern belief that when a country is conquered and a temple is destroyed, that the god or gods of that country are also defeated and destroyed. Did Yahweh survive the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah? Is he able to save? Does he want to save? How will he save? Sounds like one of those old movie serials. I love it. And we're covering this because the Gospel of Mark explores the ministry of Yeshua, or you may call him Jesus, from the unique vantage point of being a fulfillment of this section of Isaiah, the way discourse, the Isaianic New Exodus. And if we don't know chapters 40 through 55 of Isaiah, so much of the beauty of Mark is lost. Also, as this section of Isaiah is misused by anti-missionaries in order to undermine people's faith in the Savior, covering it verse by verse in the original context, I hope will protect people from being deceived. Anyway, hi, I am Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, weird name for a girl. I know, complain to my mother. I'll give her email address and phone number at the... No, I will not. Okay. And welcome to Character in Context, where I teach the historical and ancient sociological context of Scripture with an eye to developing the character of Messiah, if you prefer written material. I have 5 years worth of blog at theancientbridge.com, as well as my 6 books available on Amazon. Oh, and I am now putting up transcripts of almost all the broadcasts on the blog, so if you need to go over it later, you can go over it later once I get it up. I got my 6 books available on Amazon, including a 4-volume curriculum series dedicated to teaching the scriptural context in a way that even kids can understand it. It's called Context for Kids. And I have 2 video channels on YouTube with free Bible teachings for both adults and kids, and I have, you can find the link for those on my website. Past broadcasts of this program can be found at characterincontext.podbean.com. And, as usual, all scripture this week for this series is taken from the ESV, the English Standard Version, because that is what my interlinear is in. And, I don't normally say the name of Yahweh instead of God and Lord, but because there is just so much back and forth and so many voices and so many people being referred to in Isaiah 40 through 55 that I'm using it to help eliminate confusion. Otherwise, I always use titles because I don't like to use his name carelessly or casually. Personal preference. I'm not saying that you guys use it carelessly or casually. It's just me. We don't all have to do the same thing. It's actually okay. Now, over the last 3 weeks, we have been introduced to a number of different characters who are speaking and being spoken about. Obviously, Yahweh is the first and most prominent voice. The first week we went followed by the emergence of an anonymous voice who I call Heavenly Council Member Number 1, followed by the prophet Isaiah, and then another anonymous council member. That was Isaiah 40. And in Isaiah 41 last week, we were introduced to the nations as a character, and the gods of the nations as a character. And their characters, oh boy. who only spoke to one another in the background as they tried to subvert the plans of Yahweh. And let's see, we were also introduced last week to the warrior servant, who will be identified later as King Cyrus of Persia. That's in chapter 44. But who does not arise until 150 years after the events of Isaiah 39. Isaiah chapter 39, okay? This is way in the future. Isaiah's dead by the time Cyrus comes along. So let's get on with it. Yahweh is speaking here, and we'll continue through verse 9. Okay, behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit on him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. But, okay, there were no chapters in the Bible, or when the Bible was written. So why is Yahweh saying, behold my servant here? Because it isn't out of nowhere. We got to go back to where we left off last week, when Yahweh had just verbally laid into the nations because their representatives, their gods, were powerless, empty, nothing. It's called, Tohu and Ephes. They had nothing with which to counter Yahweh's plans to set his people free from exile. Their plans were irrelevant. It's like he was saying, okay, your representatives are nothing, but behold my servant, boom! Here's what my servant, Abdi, it's singular, personal possession. Here's what my servant is, and what my servant will do. First of all, I will uphold him, maintain him, and he is my chosen, and my soul delights in him. Okay. So, right away, it's behold my servant. Yeah, here's you guys. You guys can't even predict the future. You guys can't do anything. You can't fight me. You can't thwart my plans. But hey, look at my servant. That's what we're dealing with here. So, we got a sideline here. Targums. Oh, I hate this word. Not Targum. Targums, Codex, Reuchlinianus. It's been a long time since I took German. And Codex Nuremberg, as well as both David Kimchi, who lived in the 12th and 13th century, and Abarbanel, who lived in the 15th century. They are deeply respected Jewish biblical scholars. The two Targums here, and both of these scholars all identify the servant in Isaiah 42:1 here as the Messiah. The Targums, of course, were Jewish authored Aramaic paraphrases of the Bible, which were read in synagogues, and they fall timeline-wise between the Septuagint, which was translated into Greek from the Hebrew in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and the Masoretic text, which is what our Hebrew Bibles are based on, which originated in the 8th century of the Common Era. So the Masoretic text is very new. So the Targums show us how the Jews of the 1st century generally interpreted the scriptures. And they can have some pretty wild stuff in them, and some of them violently disagree with one another, because that's the nature of commentary, right? This is people saying, what if? Of course, Matthew, the gospel author, would agree, as he used this verse to describe Matthew's baptism. I'm saying he would agree with what the Codex and the Targums and these two Jewish scholars had to say about Isaiah 42:1 being about the Messiah. Okay, so and it's going to be important, because there's a lot of people who try and go back and they say, oh, well, the servant's referring to Israel again, but we're going to see that it can't be true because of things that are said about the servant, and then things that are said that are the opposite of what's said about the servant. Okay, so Matthew chapter 3, verse 16, and when Jesus was baptized, Immediately he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him. And he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest on him. And behold, a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." And there we go. "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights." And I want to point out something here, and I will re-emphasize this every week. And I got this clarity from a really brilliant scholar named Ben Worthington III. There's this idea floating around that the apostles used Isaiah with an agenda in order to justify what they believe, but I disagree with that. I believe that they found in Isaiah an explanation for what they had experienced firsthand. Like when Yeshua finally ascended the Father, they were like, what the heck just happened? And they went and searched the scripture and read Isaiah, and they were like, oh, dang, heck yeah, I see it now. Yeah, I don't think the apostles went through the way some people do in this day and age, and they try and find Yeshua on every page in every chapter in everything. Okay? I believe that they went through based on what had happened to them, and, you know, it's like, oh my gosh, it's all here. That's what I believe. So, continuing on with the verse, after I will put my Spirit on him, it reads, he will bring forth justice to the nations. This justice, mishpat, right rulings, an ordered way of living, justice to the oppressed. This is not describing any Gentile king, I'm telling you. It's not Cyrus. Nor does it describe Israel, who instead of bringing justice to the nations became even more unjust than the nations around them. And after the exile legislated a separation from Gentiles that made taking justice to them all but impossible. In fact, they became irrelevant historically. It's awful. They should have been the most important nation who ever lived as far as bringing justice to the nations. But they decided not to. They decided to be very, very, what do you call it, when you keep to yourself. Oh, I can't remember what the term is. They became inclusive. It wasn't like they weren't xenophobic, okay? Xenophobic is you don't have anything to do with the outside world. They weren't that. But they, compared to what they should have been, they became irrelevant. Okay? Now, this is why the Targums and Kimchi and Abarbanel saw not Israel as a people, but the Messiah as this chosen servant. Israel was and is a chosen servant, but one that failed in their mission. Therefore, we're going to be seeing, and the commentators have seen, this servant as a perfect representative of Israel, who is a son of Jacob, a son of Israel, who will fulfill and complete Israel's mission on earth. Verse 2. He will not cry aloud or lift his voice or make it heard in the street. Now, this phrase is not about staying indoors and whispering, all right? It's about having no worldly authority to speak and proclaim. He won't be standing on a street corner alongside heralds with their trumpets blowing, making announcements for whatever earthly authority has everyone under their thumb. This guy is going to be someone obscure. So, of the two servants mentioned thus far, the warrior servant or Israel, this definitely doesn't describe Cyrus. Again, he had authority. He could say whatever he wanted, wherever he wanted. And when he talked, he was like, what is it, E.F. Hutton? When he talks, everybody listens. You people who are young, you just have no idea what I just said, do you? So this isn't Cyrus. But does it describe Israel as a people? Possibly. They certainly had no real street cred with anyone after the exile, so I don't see them being described as taking justice to the nations. Verse 3, a bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. Needless to say, again, not Cyrus. The Persian kings were brutal in the extreme. They were worse than the Babylonians. Oh my gosh. Death by boat. Look that up sometime. But not on a full stomach. Is this Israel? Israel idealized? or another servant. Verse 4. He will not grow faint or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law. We discussed the meaning of the coastlands last week. It means the ends of the earth. And the islands, when we see it, means the exact same thing. The far reaches of civilization, of humanity. So the ends of the earth wait for the servant's law. This after he has established justice on the earth. Do I need to repeat that this is not Cyrus? Who never established justice on the earth, and the nations were certainly not yearning for the law of Cyrus. Death by boat, just saying. Nor can the servant be Israel as a whole, because to establish justice on earth is the business of kings in the ancient Near East, as is the institution of laws. It could be a king of Israel who is also king of the earth. That works. Verse 5. Thus says God, the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spreads out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people in it, and spirit to those who walk in it. By the way, the speaker through all this chapter has been Yahweh. It's not always, but it is. Okay, so I forgot to mention it. Now, I love this verse. I love this type of verse. God is reintroducing himself as a God who is distant and also intimate. He's describing himself, one, as the maker of the heavens and the earth, and yet, two, close enough to give breath to every living creature. Easily overlooked, but totally awesome. Also, just interesting trivia here, when it says flattened out the earth and what comes from it, that's actually blacksmithing language. Isn't that cool? Like he hammered it out on a forge. In essence, he's comparing himself to the idol makers, except they create emptiness. He creates everything of value, and everything he creates has value. His battle with the idol makers and his polemic against them really never strays very far from the forefront of what he's saying. It never really, it's always there in the background. And even when it isn't, he's going back to it soon. Verse 6 and 7. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. Who he's talking to? I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. So much here. Yahweh is speaking to the servant. Whoever it is, not Cyrus. And not in Israel in general either. And here is where it really gets proven. Here, and especially when we bring it into context with verses 18 and 19. Excuse me. Yahweh has called the servant in righteousness. Like Israel, who was taken in Yahweh's left hand, this servant who will be given as a covenant for the people and a light to the nations. So, Israel was called in righteousness. It's true. They didn't live up to it. Okay? They were not judged right. That's what righteous means. It means to be judged right. When two people are judged, one is judged righteous and one is judged unrighteous. Righteous doesn't mean you've done everything right. Righteous is a term from Zedekiah. It just means that you were determined to be right in the court case, in the whatever. So I don't know why I'm tripping over this. But Israel was called to that. They didn't live up to it. All right? But this servant will be given as a covenant for the people and a light for the nations. This servant will open blind eyes and deliver people from bondage, specifically those who are sitting in darkness. Yahweh will save, and deliver through the agency of this servant. He's already taking credit for it. This will be his doing, his will, his plan. Verse 8, I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. And what he does, he's saying right here, will not be attributed to carved idols or to the gods of the nations. Foreign gods will not get credit for what he is doing through the servant. No one will be able to take the glory of this salvation from him. And I mean, we look at it, it's like, goodness sakes, this servant is going to be given as a covenant for the people. That's not Israel. Israel was never given as a covenant for the people. They never served as a light for the nations. They've never opened blind eyes. They've never delivered people from bondage. They've never delivered those from bondage who were sitting in darkness. This is somebody else. Verse 9, behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. This goes back to the speech of disputation with the idols that we saw last week in chapter 41. Yahweh alone can call the future forth before it happens. The gods were silent when challenged to do the same. They couldn't do it in the past, and they're just as blind about the future. Now, you remember 2 weeks ago, and actually we talked about it briefly last week too, when we talked about the law of continuity, the ancient law of continuity. When there was no such thing as a new thing, quote unquote, that they just talked about in verse 9, because the future was completely bound up in what had always happened in the past. Israel can't be delivered from exile because no exiled people had ever been delivered and returned. To declare it as if it had already happened before the fact was a new thing. So, there's the end to exile at the agency of Cyrus, but there's also this other servant that Cyrus does not meet the minimum qualifications to be. Now, the prophet, in response to this new thing, replies with a new song. So now we're changing voice. Now it's the prophet. So the new thing has to be responded to with a new song. The two are connected. A new thing requires a new song of praise to Yahweh. And it's verses 10 through 12. And the prophet says, sing to the Lord a new song, his praise from the ends of the earth. You who go down to the sea and all that fills it, the coastlands and all their inhabitants. Let the desert and its cities lift up their voice, the villages that Kedar inhabits. Let the inhabitants of Selah sing for joy. Let them shout from the top of the mountains. Let them give glory to the Lord and declare his praise from the coastlands. End of the earth again, those who go down to the sea, coastlands and their inhabitants. This is not Israel, who is going to be praising because of this new thing. The desert dwellers of Kedar, that's in Arabia, okay? The inhabitants of Selah, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, translates Selah as Petra in Jordan. These are Gentiles, not Jews. This, for all intents and purposes, this is the entire world as far as biblical lyrical poetry is concerned. This is the entire world dazzled and in awe of Yahweh's great deliverance of his people out of nowhere. This is going to be a new thing. People are going to marvel at it. Their jaws are going to be hitting the floor. They're not going to know what to do. They're going to question everything because this doesn't happen. No one escapes from Babylon. Heck, no one defeats Babylon, but we're going to see it's all going to happen. We really don't understand how exciting this was and how impossible this was because it's history for us. And we think things change all the time, but in the old world, they didn't. Hi, I'm Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, and welcome back to Character and Context. This is part 4 of Isaiah and the Messiah. We're going through Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 in preparation for the Gospel of Mark studies that we're going to do next year. We just finished talking about verses, Isaiah 42, verses 10 through 12, where the Gentiles are responding to this new thing that Yahweh has sworn to do. They're responding with a new song, because a new thing needs a new song, because you can't sing the same old praises when God has done something entirely new. And this is the Gentiles. It talks about the people from the ends of the earth, those who go down to the sea, all that fills it, the coastlands and their inhabitants. Let the deserts and cities lift up their voice, the villages that Kedar inhabits, the inhabitants of Selah sing for joy. It's the Gentiles in awe of what Yahweh's doing. And of course, the immediate picture in this for the exiles is an end to their exile. But more than this, let's look at the context. The context is in reference to the servant that's been being talked about from the beginning. This servant who the coastlands are waiting for his law. This servant who will open the blind eyes, who will lead prisoners out of the dungeon. So yes, there are echoes of what is going to be done when Babylon comes out of exile, but it's more than that, because the glove doesn't fit entirely. It's a greater exodus than that. The entire nations of the world are going to be rejoicing. So that's more than just the Jews returning from exile. That is a greater salvation. And so let's keep on going. Verse 13, the Lord goes out like a mighty man. Like a man of war, he stirs up his zeal. He cries out. He shouts aloud. He shows himself mighty against his foes. And so here we are still, it's the prophet speaking, like it has been since verse 10. Now this is unmistakable warrior language here. Yahweh the warrior. And we're going to see echoes of this in the Gospel of Mark used to describe Yeshua's battles with demons. It's always in battle language. It's so evocative. A warrior marching into battle, getting himself all psyched to meet his enemies on the battle lines, shouting and screaming. Think about the movie 300, except with only one warrior who is way scarier. Now Yahweh becomes the main speaker again, and the word I will be repeated over and over and over again through verse 16, over 10 times. All right, now let's just look at verses 14 and 15. For a long time I have held my peace. Now this is Yahweh speaking again. I have kept still and restrained myself. Now I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and pant. I will lay waste to mountains and hills, and dry up all their vegetation. I will turn rivers into islands, and dry up the pools. Now verse 14, let's repeat that. For a long time I have held my peace. I have kept still and restrained myself. Now I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and pant. It isn't really comparing him to a woman. That language is really generally reserved for the Ruach, the Spirit. No, this is portraying the intensity of birthing something new, something going back to verse 9. The intensity of the screaming of a woman driven by love and instinct to bring forth life in the midst of pain. There is nothing half-hearted about a woman in the midst of giving birth. Then in verse 15, he's also portrayed as having supremacy over nature. He can create and he can destroy in his wrath. I will just, what does he say? I will destroy the mountain. I will lay waste the mountains and hills and dry up the vegetation. I will turn rivers into islands, dry up the pools. Absolute supremacy over his creation. Verse 16, And I will lead the blind in a way that they do not know. In paths they have not known, I will guide them. I will turn the darkness before them into light, and the rough places into level ground. These are the things I do. I do not forsake them. This is such tender language, such a diversion from the Yahweh warrior. But again, we saw the exact same thing 2 weeks ago in Isaiah 40, verses 10 through 11, where one moment he's the mighty warrior and the next he's a gentle shepherd. Yahweh is reminding his people that he is not one or the other, but both. Here he is leading the blind in a way they do not know, but who are the blind? We'll get to that in a bit. It'll tell us. 17 and 18. They are turned back and utterly put to shame, who trust in carved idols, who say to metal images, you are our gods. Hear, you deaf, and look, you blind, that you may see. So we got pow. Okay? We've got an idol polemic again. Yahweh portrays himself as a mighty warrior and the gentle guide, and then bam, contrast those who trust in him with those who trust in idols. I love verse 17. In the Hebrew, it literally says they will be shamed with shame. That's shameful. Okay, dang. Yeboshu boshet. Yahweh's making them look like blind fools and referring back again to Psalm 115, which we're not going to read again this week, where everyone who worships idols becomes like them, blind, deaf, and powerless. But that is his people because they were living, that's his people too, because they were living as idolaters before the destruction of their home, and they're still believing that Yahweh isn't able to save them because of Babylon and its gods. They're still believing that that Yahweh is, excuse me. Ooh, I'm having sinus fun today. Anyway, he's literally saying in modern terms, open your eyes, guys. It's time to wake up and smell the coffee. But more than that, this has been building for a long time, since Isaiah 40:27, which I'll read again before repeating that last verse and going forward again. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God. I can't remember if I mentioned it the first week, but this is a flat-out accusation that Yahweh's blind, because they're saying they're hidden from him. He can't see them, and that he's deaf because he's not listening to their petitions about what justice they figured they've been denied. You know, it's like, there's a reason why the word chutzpah is Jewish, because is Hebrew, because, man, these guys are sitting in exile for being idolaters. They're saying, we had been robbed. Okay. But, yeah, just wow, okay? Let's just review. They got themselves into this mess, as I detailed in Isaiah 1 through 39, or I didn't, but Isaiah did, and many, many other places. Ezekiel even ate bread cooked over dung and played army men for over a year just to show their parents what big trouble they were in. And Jeremiah, let's not even review what he said and what they did to him. Yet they haven't learned. They haven't been worshiping him in exile. We'll get to that next week. They're believing him to be powerless, defeated, etc., etc., etc. They're calling him deaf-blind and disinterested. So let's do this again and move on. Verse 18 through 20. Hear, you deaf, and look, you blind, that you may see. Okay, who is he talking to here? Let's find out, because this is Yahweh again. Who is blind but my servant, or deaf as my messenger who I send? Who is blind as my dedicated one, or blind as the servant of the Lord? He sees many things, but does not observe them. His ears are open, but he does not hear. Ow. Now, Israel can't be that chosen servant of 42:1. All right? They can't be that servant leading the blind and removing blindness, because they are still blind, and Yahweh just said so. So they can't unblind anyone, and they can't rescue anyone from the darkness. We aren't doing a blind leading the blind scenario here. Despite the fact that they are servants. And yes, verse 19 is plural. Remember in verse 1 it was singular. Verse 19 is plural. And where it says, who is blind but my servant? Servants, plural, not singular. Yahweh's saying, I'm not blind. You're blind. You're my servants, but you're blind. I chose you to be my messengers to the world, but you're deaf. So nowhere is their servant status, their chosen status, ever revoked or denied. But it's clear that they've been cursed with a blindness that leaves them unable to fulfill their calling as God's people. And the worst part of it is that they as a nation have seen and recorded and preserved evidence of extraordinary wonders that are unparalleled in history and even in mythology. The Exodus account, the defeat of their enemies so many times when they didn't even have to lift a finger, miracles galore, Elijah and Elisha, Moses, these guys were without excuse. Oh, Samson, Deborah, it goes on and on and on. Joshua and Caleb. You know, they're without excuse. They say, quote unquote, many things, but they pay no attention. They have ears that work just fine, but they're not listening. And because of this, they're howling about how unjustly they've been treated by a God who's really not impressing them. But only because they truly are spiritually blind and deaf. Exile has taught them nothing. And so, how did they get blind? How did they get deaf? We got to go back to Isaiah 6 for this. So, what do we do with this here? Isaiah 6, starting in verse 8. And I heard the voice, of course, this is the commissioning of Isaiah, very famous. Y'all know it. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here I am, send me. You know, we all know Hineni. Here I am, send me. And he said, go and say to this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull, and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. Then I said, how long, O Lord? And he said, until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is a desolate waste. And the Lord removes the people far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. So he's saying, not only will the land be desolate, but it will be burned again. So this isn't even the last time. So in the midst of the worst of their idolatry, in Isaiah 6 it was bad, okay? Yahweh sends Isaiah, whom we see here being commissioned in the year that King Uzziah died, which scholars say happened sometime around 740 before the Common Era, give or take a few years. So around the same year when the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom of Israel began. This is when this prophecy was recorded. It's as though that issue is squared away, they were cut off, and now Yahweh is focusing on the sins of Judah in the form of oppression, idolatry, deception, faked worship, etc., etc. The chapter before this is called the Song of the Vineyard, where all of Judah and Jerusalem are soundly condemned for their wickedness, and Yahweh tells them he's finally had enough, and he's calling down judgment in the form of destruction through the nations. Isaiah serves as Yahweh's prophet through the reign of 4 kings, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Uzziah was a good king, but he famously committed the arrogant sin of taking a censer filled with incense into the holy place in the temple where it's forbidden for anyone but the priest to go, and he was stricken with leprosy for the rest of his life. It was in the year of his death that he was, that the blind and deaf curse of Isaiah takes place. So we have Isaiah speaking this prophecy / curse on the people that they will keep on hearing but will not understand the past, and they will keep on seeing but they will not perceive what's going on now. And actually, it's not Isaiah speaking the curse, it's Yahweh speaking the curse. Now, they have been blessed and cared for like no other nation on earth before or since. They've experienced the miraculous. But they still just don't get that God is jealously demanding their exclusive allegiance. They don't get that worshiping him half-heartedly is not enough. They're treating him like the pagans treated their gods, who were not loved but simply cared for or else. They're not behaving with the expressed loving kindness, patience, and generosity of God. They've failed to be image bearers. When they get into trouble with other nations, being tested, they unfaithfully, untrustingly, send money and items from the temple of Yahweh to other nations in order to enlist their aid. I hope you know how insulting that is. And even the good kings were guilty of it time and again. You just do not loot the temple of Yahweh to enlist humans to fight your battles. Can anything possibly be more insulting? They were saying to Yahweh, you are powerless and we don't trust you, long before the exile. They just didn't understand their special position, and because they didn't see Yahweh as special. And because of this, they could not make Yahweh's Torah great. Who can possibly be impressed with the instructions of a God whose own people are constantly giving away his own temple treasures? Okay. So back to Isaiah 42, verse 21, where the prophet once again starts speaking. Verse 21, the Lord was pleased for his righteousness' sake to magnify his law and make it glorious. So right there, his righteousness' sake. His law. Now, of course, law here is Torah, but law is not a great word. It's not as good a word as instructions, because law is a harder word than Torah, and our conception of the word law is very Greek in nature, as hard do's and don'ts, whereas Torah means instructions, which is a word associated with wisdom and judgment. If not working on the Sabbath is a law, for example, then it can be regulated that not lifting a finger is more important than saving a life, or changing a tire on a car when you see a family stranded on the side of the road in the middle of July in Texas. Okay? Ignorance of the law is no excuse. Law is final and hard, okay? But instruction, Torah, under the banner of loving God and one's neighbor, leaves room to breathe and do what is right instead of what is legislated. You can change that tire and be a blessing to that family in the name of Yahweh, and have done better than if you had legalistically stayed in your car and did nothing to help them. This is what Yahweh's wisdom is, okay? Teaching us to love God and one another. I always say that the Torah is full of examples of the bare minimum requirements for keeping us safe from one another, and of course, Yeshua taught us to go above and beyond all that. I say Yeshua taught Torah on steroids. So Israel was to magnify this instruction by keeping it to the point that all the world would marvel at the glory of God's love and wisdom and mercy and generosity. Of course, it didn't happen. Despite all they heard and saw, they behaved as though they were blind and deaf, and so a spiritual blindness and deafness fell upon them as a curse. Just right from the mouth of Yahweh, okay? But it was as a punishment. It was discipline to teach them to respect Yahweh And as a punishment, he destroyed everything and sent them into exile so they can learn how good they had it before under him. And as we keep seeing it, they are still not getting it. Okay, verse 22. But this is a people plundered and looted. They are all of them trapped in holes and hidden in prisons. They have become plunder with none to rescue, spoil with none to say, restore. The point of all this is that no one and nothing they have trusted in is able to save them, or even cares to save them. They put their faith in the nations, and a nation destroyed not only them, but all the nations which they used to turn to help. So this, it was a total and complete disaster. They put their faith in other gods who are emptiness and nothing. No one, as the verse says, is there to restore them. Specifically, no one's going to send them back home, which is what restoration was. Yahweh here is challenging them to finally listen and face the truth of what has happened. Their ears work fine, but they have to be willing to not only trust that Yahweh can and will deliver them back home, but they need to accept why they were in exile in the first place. Now, this next verse is just maddening. 24. Who gave up Jacob to the looter, and Israel to the plunderers? Was it not the Lord against whom we have sinned, in whose ways they would not walk, and whose laws they would not obey? Okay, so the prophet speaking here. That's right. That's right, guys. Yahweh wasn't conquered. The Jews are in exile not because someone overcame Yahweh, but because Yahweh ordained it and gave Nebuchadnezzar the authority and the ability to do it. Let's read that again. Who gave up Jacob to the looter and Israel to the plunderers? Was it not the Lord against whom we have sinned, and in whose ways they would not walk, and whose laws they would not obey? If they don't finally understand that and humble themselves, then it'll all have been for nothing, and the cycle will just start all over again. Jacob was given over, looted, plundered, not only with Yahweh's permission, but by his command. They had sinned against him for hundreds and hundreds of years. They refused to walk according to his commandments, and would not live with the kindness and generosity born out of gratitude for being released from slavery in Egypt in the first place. They became more like Pharaoh themselves. They became more like Pharaoh than like Yahweh. They were commanded to become like Yahweh. They were even refusing to release their Hebrew debt slaves at the end there. Check out Jeremiah 34. It's just disgusting. Verse 25, Yahweh, poured on him, Jacob, the heat of his anger and the might of battle. It set him on fire all around. But he, Jacob, did not understand. It burned him, Jacob, up, but he did not take it to heart. Let's read that again. I'm going to read it with the substitutions. So Yahweh poured out on Jacob the heat of Yahweh's anger and the might of battle. It set Jacob on fire all around, but Jacob did not understand. It burned Jacob up, but Jacob did not take it to heart. What was Yahweh's response to this affront to his kindness? He poured out wrath on his people, hoping they would finally see that they'd sinned against him and had earned their punishment. But as we know from Jeremiah, they were stubborn to the end, even imprisoning Jeremiah for suggesting that the conquest was their own fault and the siege of Jerusalem. Jerusalem and Judah burned to the ground along with the temple. And yet it says that they still didn't hear what the prophets had been saying, and they didn't see the truth of what was going on all around them. They didn't take it to heart that it was their fault, their consequence for how they had treated Yahweh and one another. Nothing could possibly be more tragic and heartbreaking. If that didn't work, what would. Well, next week we go to chapter 43, which begins in English with the two words, "but now." Is there hope on the horizon? See you next week.